Chapter 12. I hung back, very nearly resolved to flee and take my chances with Falconer, had I known where he was, or even on my own in that unknown city. But just then, Sander turned and beckoned to me with a cheerful and friendly countenance that I swallowed my misgivings and followed him into the lesson room. The scene within was not at all what I had expected. There were no sullen students lined up on benches with slates in their hands, nor was there any sign of anyone being beaten. The sounds had apparently come from two boys mock sword fighting with wooden singlesticks. One was Nick, the fellow who had been the butt of the players' jokes the day before and who had played the Queen in Hamlet. The other was the player's Ophelia, a slender boy no taller than I, and far better suited to playing girls' parts than the swaggering Nick, who seemed too husky in voice and in build to portray anything but older women. On the other side of the room, two players were dancing a jig to a tune played on a hautboy. Nearby, Samuel and James, the two hopefuls, were turning somersets atop a row of rush mats under the eye of a small, athletic-looking man. Mr. Phillips, Sander informed me, he's our stage manager, among other things. Mr. Armin, you already know. He gestured towards the man who had run afoul of Falconer, and who had stood up for me before the other players. He was demonstrating sword positions to Nick and his partner. He nodded in our direction, and Sander approached him. "Where shall I start our new boy?"
"Stramazone!"
Mr. Armin shouted, and I shrank back, believing we were being cursed in some foreign tongue. The two students made slicing motions with their sticks.
"He may as well begin here,"
Mr. Armin said in a perfectly civil tone. Then he shouted,
"Reversa!"
The two boys cut with their sticks from the other side.
"Get him a single stick."
For the next hour, I stood in a rank with Sander and the others, facing Mr. Armin and attempting to duplicate his stance and movements. I had never had anything to do with weapons beyond the mock skirmishes with elder sticks at the orphanage. Before long, my limbs began to ache. I could sense that the others were secretly laughing at my bumbling efforts, and I longed to throw the stick aside, preferably at them, and show them my skill with a pen. But to do so, of course, would be to give myself away. I would have to continue to seem a willing apprentice until I could complete my real mission here. But when I did, when I had stolen the script from under their very noses, then I would be the one to laugh. At last, Mr. Armin called a halt, and he and Nick paired off. Nick was armed with a real rapier now, blunted, of course. They saluted with their swords, their faces smiling and cordial. Then Mr. Armin said,
"Have at you!"
and the two transformed before our eyes into deadly enemies. Their blades clashed and parted and met again with such rapidity that my eye could scarcely follow. Sander and Ophelia cheered them on. Their sentiments were obviously with Mr. Armin, but they shouted encouragement to Nick as well. Even with my ignorance of fencing, I could see that Mr. Armin was holding back, giving Nick time to ward and counter. The fencing scene in the play had displayed the same measured pace. As with the play, I was drawn into the drama. Just as I was tempted to shout a word of encouragement myself, Mr. Armin effortlessly caught Nick's sideways blow on the guard of his rapier, flung his arm outward, and delivered a quick but gentle stoccata to Nick's unguarded chest. "Touch," he said. Nick's face, already red from exertion, grew redder. He peevishly flung down the rapier and stalked off. Mr. Armin ignored his outburst and approached us.
"Do you three feel you're ready for a real weapon?"
"No, sir," we said, almost as one person.
"Then go, practice your passatas," he said. "We have an audience who pays to see us. We don't need you lot standing about gawking."
As we moved away, Sander said, "Widge is going to need a bit of coaching, I think. Do you want to do it, Julian, or shall I?" Ophelia, whose name was apparently Julian, shrugged. "We could take turns." "All right with you, Widge?" Sander asked. Unused as I was to being asked my preferences, I took a moment to reply. "Oh, aye, I don't mind. But Mr. Armin said—" "Fie on what Mr. Armin said," Sonder replied, but softly. "I've done so many passatas I could do them in my sleep." "Just be sure you do them on your side of the bed." He laughed. "We'll soon have you doing them in your sleep as well. Now, the first thing we'll have to show you is the 3 wards. 3 words? No, wards." He held the single stick at the height of his forehead. "This is the high ward." I copied his stance. He moved the stick to his waist. "Broad ward." His hand went down near his knee. "Base ward." "You might just as well show him the right way, Cook," a voice said. I turned to see Nick standing close by. "Here, let me have that stick." Sonder gave it reluctantly. Nick planted himself in front of me, a distinctly unpleasant smile on his face. "I'll learn you properly." "Let him be," Sonder said, not as forcefully as he might have. "I'm only going to see that he learns his lesson," Nick said innocently. "Now then, which is it? You know what a widge is where I come from." My throat felt too tight to speak. I shook my head. "A horse. I think I'll call you Horse, though you look more like an ass to me. Hold your stick like this, Horse, the hand close to the knee, and the tip pointing at your opponent's throat bowl." With a shaking hand, I tried to mirror his position. "Get your point up," he commanded. I was so slow to respond, he whacked my stick sharply. "Get the point up, I said. Get the point." I? Do I look like the captain of a ship? Nay." "Ah, you can neigh like a horse as well. Now, bring your your hand, in closer to your leg, else your opponent might do this." He brought his stick swiftly down on my knuckles. With a gasp, I let my stick fall. "And if you do that, he'll certainly do this." He lunged, and his stick struck my breastbone painfully. My fear gave way to anger, and I scrambled for the fallen weapon. Laughing, Nick knocked it out of my reach. When I was young at the orphanage and the bigger boys taunted me, I invariably burst into tears. But finding that it was an invitation to further abuse, I had learned to refrain from tears, whatever the provocation. I even prided myself on it. Now, facing Nick, I trembled with shame and frustration. But I was dry-eyed. "Pick it up, Horse," Nick ordered me. With his foot, he sent it skating across the floor at me. As I hesitated, unsure whether I would look more like a fool by picking it up or by letting it lie, Julian suddenly stepped between us, his stick at broad ward. "That's enough, Nick. We can all see he's no match for you. And you are, I suppose." "No," the boy replied evenly. "But Sander and I together, maybe." Nick scowled at Sander, who had taken the cue and come up behind him. "That's unfair odds." "So is you against Widge," Sander said. "Give him a few months of practice and he'll go around with you, won't you, Widge?" Though in truth I meant to be gone long before that, I nodded. "Aye." Nick pointed his stick threateningly at me. "Study your footwork well then, hobby horse, for I mean to hobble you." He gave a token thrust towards Sander, who jumped back. Laughing, Nick tossed the stick aside and swaggered off. Only then did I notice Mr. Armin watching from across the room. Why did I not put a stop to it? "I suppose," Julian said, "he believes a man should fight his own battles." "Then why did you step in?" I said crossly. "I beg your humble pardon. Next time I'll let him put a dent in your stupid pudding basin." Julian stomped away. "A bit of a hothead, isn't it?" I observed. "And you're a bit of a muttonhead," Sonder said mildly. "He was only trying to help." "I don't need any help," I said sullenly. "Yes, you do. Now why don't you take up that stick and we'll start over. High ward." As I grudgingly strove to mimic his movements, he said, "Nick isn't really such a bad sort, you know. He was just testing your mettle. Broadward. I don't think Nick is truly mean at heart. He's just going through a bad time. He's been apprentice for 6 or 7 years, and now he'll have to begin playing a man's part. On the stage or in life? Both, I suppose. Low ward." "That's as may be," I said, "but we can scarcely judge a person by what's alike inside. It's the outside what we have to do with." Sander lowered his single stick and sighed. "Well, on the inside, you may be a very good fencer, but on the outside, you stink." "I washed but last week," I protested. Sander laughed. "I didn't mean it literally, you goose. It means you're terrible. Come, we'll try some passatas." It was a long morning. When Mr. Armand finally tired of trying to make us into some semblance of scrimmers, his word for swordsman, he passed us on to Mr. Phillips, who worked on our diction, mostly mine, and something called projection, which meant, as nearly as I could tell, shouting more loudly than the audience. To my relief, the afternoon was less taxing. The company was presenting a play called Every Man Out of His Humour, which fit my mood exactly. As the bookkeeper was ill, Sander was given the task of holding the playbook and throwing out lines to players who were floundering. I was posted, along with Samuel, one of the hopefuls, in the tiring room to help the players change costume. In my ignorance, I did more to hinder them than to help, yet none complained, except Nick. When I stepped on the hem of his gown, he aimed a blow at me. I ducked it easily. Ducking was one athletic skill I had long since mastered. Before he could try it again, his cue came. "I'll see you later, horse," he growled, and swept out. His voice was so much at odds with his feminine appearance that I could not help snickering. "Such a lady," Sam said, and set us both laughing. Julian came into the tiring room, greeted us, and retreated into the wardrobe to change. I stared after him. "Feels us too good for us, does it?" "Oh, it's nothing against us," Sam said. "He's a modest one is all. Mr. Shakespeare's the same, and Mr. Burbage. Don't like others pawing them, I guess." The mention of Mr. Shakespeare brought to mind something that the day's constant activity had pushed aside, the lost script. If I did not find it soon, someone else would. Leaving Sam to take care of matters in the tiring room, I crept up the stairs to the balcony. My luck was good that day. The balcony was not in use. I drew back the drapery and inspected the spot where I'd concealed myself the day before. So much for luck. The notebook was not there. Where in heaven's name was it then? Had some member of the company found it? Then it came to me. The man in the crowd who had jostled me from behind. He had smiled so sincerely. It never occurred to me that he'd dipped his thieving fingers in my wallet. "Gog's bread," I murmured. "Has stolen me script." The thief must have been upset to discover that he had filched not a purse but a book full of scribbles. He could hardly return it, though, and however great his frustration, he could not have held a candle to the dismay that I felt at that moment, knowing that all my work and worry was for naught.